Okay. Yeah. I want this removed here.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Should be seeing you. You want to start with your presentation?
No. Let me introduce myself.
Okay.
You've already introduced
Yes.
me, not let me get to the presentation right away.
Okay. Let me know when you want to share.
Okay. So that's okay. We are unmuted, isn't it? Welcome to us, colleagues. It's a good afternoon to all of us. Dale has already introduced me to all of us, and I think we are supposed now to get into business. The area of peace education, which I'm focusing on, that's something which I developed interest in, and I thought under the tutelage of some specialists, I might further enrich my own understanding of what peace education is. But my intention is not just coming up with something which is on paper, but I intend to influence policy in Zimbabwe so that even in the schools system, what I'm working on right now, it becomes acceptable. So I'm making all I'm applying a lot of effort into it to make sure that the ideas which are going to come out of this, they can influence some people to take a different line of thinking so that we can have peace. Probably, I might say that we have not enjoyed what I would call the real peace which we are supposed to have enjoyed, of course, even since independence, because of certain skirmishes which have been arising and so on and so forth. So it dawned upon me that instead of having this issue of violence being perennial, how best can we bring it to an end? How can we mitigate the violence? And so I thought, well, why not look at peace education? So I'm having the assistance of Professor Dale to take me through, and I'm gaining quite a lot. I've gained already quite a lot, and I've got different dimensions now from where I can attack the issue of peace education. So I think we can now get into our topic.
Press share.
Let's see, share. That's fine. Yeah, thank you very much. My topic, that's reflecting on demilitarizing the mind through peace education, and that's from an African perspective. Why an African perspective? The understanding here is that people might have a lot of misconceptions about what happens in Africa when people hear about the wars which are taking place, the hunger, the poverty, and so on and so forth. So if we are to understand the aspects of demilitarizing, there is need for us to also to understand a bit of background to it, so that we can look at the phases of militarization and then the demilitarization, which is the issue of focus. So I will just brush through some of these issues which I believe people are aware of, even though they are more historical than anything else, where we talk about the scramble for and partitioning of Africa. And here we are saying that because of European imperialism in Africa, there was a tendency of bringing in some violent approaches to how certain systems were done. You see, when European countries scrambled for some territory in Africa, they wanted to establish some trade routes, they wanted some markets for their products, they wanted some resources, mineral resources and otherwise. And from a European point of view, that was also the time when they were struggling for mastery, where the power of a nation was realized through the expanse of its empire or spheres of control. Then what later on happened was the Berlin Conference, which took place 1884 to 1885. This was an initiative by Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, who was saying, instead of us European countries fighting over some territory in Africa, why not parcel out Africa systematically so that whoever has got a portion, we know that there is effective occupation. So that's how African countries were now created. That's how boundaries came about. Otherwise, before then, the continent of Africa was just inhabited by black people who had the mobility to get wherever they wanted. There were no boundaries and so on and so forth. So boundaries, they are introduced after the Berlin Conference, where European countries were now saying, if you are supposed to claim possession of a given territory, then we are supposed to be having some marked boundaries. So that's when boundaries started. So you will realize then that scramble was not carried out peacefully. Right? This was an issue for conquest, so there was no peace to talk about. And even the European countries, they also came close to war, fighting against each other over some territory in Africa. Yes, there can be some incidents which can be cited. We have got the Fashoda incident, we have got the Tangier crisis, where the European countries almost fought over territory in Africa. So here we are now talking about the fragmentation and containment of African territory. That is the basis now of militarism, where we are saying it's force which was applied, it's coercion which was applied, and that's where we now see gun justice coming in. Now, as we get further into this presentation, there are certain concepts which I think we are supposed to bear in mind or know about. Stuart has given us what I believe is the brief and very precise definition of what peace is the presence of justice. Then in terms of violence, because we are continuously going to refer to some violent moments, that violence is something which we can say it's a harm which is avoidable. And here I was just borrowing from Galtang, from Reardon and Stewart. They've said a lot about it. But there are forms of violence which are worth talking about here, where we can have direct violence. Now, direct violence, we are now talking about there is some high level of aggressiveness, aggressive warfare, where we are saying people have actually drawn some battlegrounds. There is physical fighting. There is an exchange of gunfire. And so where we now have got those battle lines, battlefronts which have been established, that's direct violence. Then we can also talk about structural or systemic violence, where we are now talking about there are institutions which are established, even through some governance system, which are supposed to make sure that whether they are services or whatever, they are delivered to the people. Now, structural violence, it comes out through the functions and the manner in which those systems are supposed to operate. Now, the social institutions which we may be talking about, that's where you get some discrimination coming in. That's where you have inequality coming in. And all these things, they will also breed their own byproducts like the poverty and even the conflict, which we are going to talk about. Then the cultural aspects. I have made mention here of religion, language, art, and I said, etc., etc. But in the majority of cases, it's when two or more groups come together, there is cultural dynamism, which we have to expect, because one group is going to learn from another. And so as those changes go on, there is an element of one culture being superior, the other culture being subordinated. And ultimately, the subordinate culture is swallowed or it is overshadowed. to such an extent that you are talking about a culture which has been diluted, so to speak. So the coming in of European countries also into Africa, they brought with them some religion, they brought with them some language, and all this had an impact on Africa. So we would want to find out how these different types or forms of violence might be interpreted within the African context. Now, that leads me now to look at a structural analysis of militarism, where we are now seeing how the military mind might have grown to such extremes when we are talking about an Africa which has never been peaceful. So I have made use of a three-tier approach, where the first part I'm dealing with the pre-coloniality of violence, where I'm saying before Bismarck even called for the Berlin Conference in 1884-85, it does not mean that there was no violence in Africa. It was there, but here we are now talking about the level of violence, the magnitude of violence, and the general impact which it might have had on society. So we are saying violence here, it was there. It involved a number of ethnic groups. There were some raids and counter raids over cattle, raids over minerals, and so on and so forth. And there were a lot of migrations which were taking place in Africa, where people would not claim ownership of a given portion or a given territory. Land was freely accessible, and boundaries were not in existence. But that does not mean that there were no violent clashes. Violent clashes would always be there, where there might have been some clash over some resources, but the manner in which they would solve this was not fighting, as it were. They might have fought, but to a limited extent. The best way was for one group or the vanquished, they would move away. The defeated, they would move away. The villains, they would move away. So that's why we say some of these developments, they brought about some element of violence, which we would say it was already there before it was heightened. But again, through this pre-colonial period, the coming in of missionaries in Africa, it also heightened the level of militarism. Why? Because the missionaries, they are the first people, together with the early explorers, those are adventure seekers, they are the ones who brought in the issue of weapons in Africa. Guns were unknown before then, but upon the arrival of missionaries, guns were introduced. And the African kings, they befriended missionaries largely because they knew they could acquire some guns, they could secure some guns from them. And guns were a mark of superiority in that any kingdom which wanted to expand, it had to fight for space. So that's where we see militarism again coming in. Then the coloniality of violence. We now see the colonial system. The European countries have now parceled out Africa among themselves, and so conquest now becomes more violent, particularly the structural part of the violence now, because that's where we see a lot of social institutions which divided people, where discrimination was rife, where oppressive policies were passed, where even ethnic inequality, it was aggravated deliberately to develop that divide and rule system so that they could now be able to control the colonies. So what we see operating within the colonial system now was more of coercion and more of violence, in order to make sure that the indigenous inhabitants, they were subdued. So that's heightening militarism. And when we are now looking at post-coloniality of violence, we are saying the violence which we are currently experiencing or realizing in Africa, That's some sort of a continuum. It has got certain roots, it has got a genesis, and it has now continued it has now continued, almost unabated, I would say. So, for the Africans to gain independence, they had to fight. So we see liberation movements coming in. And these liberation movements, as Frantz Fanon would say, there is no way you can talk about any liberation which comes your way unless you make use of violence. If conquest was violent, then decolonization, obviously, it has to be violent. Because there should have been some reasons why the conquest had to be violent. They had some resources, they had some interests. And so to merely get rid of those interests without fighting, that's unheard of. And that is why the African countries had to go for some liberation struggle in order to gain independence. Now, we are talking about people who grew up, who were nurtured in violence, and they also embark on violence for them to be free. A culture of violence now develops. In terms of even the general behavior, even their psyche, the belief might be that if you are to get anything good, you have to fight for it. You see? So that's where we are saying there is some element of violence being a continuum. Let's wage a war of liberation for us to be free and for us to access the resources. Already, the liberation movement, it is inviting violence. So that's where we are now coming from. That's the African perspective. So today, you would be told that the violence which Africa is experiencing, it's not of its own making, but it has got a history. And even today in the post-colony, the army which we do have, the police which we have, and the militia groups which we are talking about, killing people, maiming people, and so on and so forth. These are, we may say, the making of the past, where the army has always been there, but not for the people. The police was there, but not largely for the people, because there were some oppressive systems which were in place. There was racial segregation which was in place. There was no equal treatment. And so the Africans were now growing that mind of violence. If you are supposed to have something good which comes your way, you have to fight for it. All right. So that might again explain why there is that multiplicity of military coups in Africa. You'll understand that from 1960 to this day, I think Africa has had more than 280 military governments coming in and going out. Right. Now, that's a culture of violence. That's a culture of violence. And we may then ask, why are they so violent? They are violent because colonialism schooled them into violence. It schooled them into violence. And that's where they came to believe about so much into gun justice. Instead of discussing, instead of coming together and talking about whatever people might say peacefully, the gun has to be the solution. They learnt it. And African nationalists, they grew up through that system where there was gun justice. And so even today, for them to rule, they believe that it is the military which is supposed to be doing or running everything. So that's a problem which we are saying it's a carryover from the colonial legacy. It's a carryover. And that's why we are also seeing there is a deterioration of social services in schools, in hospitals. The real reason is that the military mind, which they do have, budgets, the greater portion of the budget, it goes towards the military. Whether it's peacetime, whether it's wartime, the greater chunk of the budget, it goes along the military. right? Buying some weapons from the Americas, buying some weapons from Russia, and it's merely stockpiling of weapons. To fight whom? When the social services are non-existent. It's the military mind which people have been schooled into. The violent exposition which we are saying people have been schooled into. So that's why we would see there is that reinforcement of inequalities even to this day, because there is patronage politics, there is clientelism. You go to the next person who is a relative, you go to the next person who is a friend. There is a lot of this nepotism which is happening. Why? The system which these people grew up in, it was more of the law of the jungle, the survival of the fittest, and also the survival of those your own kin. You are not worried about what happens to the rest, but you are worried about yourself. So the post-coloniality of violence, it has brought us into a religious fundamentalism. I think we might have read about the Boko Haram and the havoc which it is wreaking in Nigeria, kidnapping school children, destroying structures, and so on and so forth in the name of religion. Then in East Africa, we also have Al-Shabaab. So the mentality, which is so militaristic, how has it managed to gain ground amongst the African people? That's the African perspective we are talking about. And so one would say that this is something which is ingrained. To make use of a West African expression, it has entered their blood. So militarism, violence, and African lives, we are saying they are almost inseparable. Why? Because the African had grown through different phases of which have all indicated that in order to survive, you are supposed to fight. So that's where we are getting these militarisms coming from. So what then would be the military mind? Now, I'm taking the military mind not from the professional issue of someone having gone through military training and so on. Yes, they do have their own way of doing it. But here we are now talking about moving away from a military exposition to a civilian exposition. So the mind, according to Huntington, he says, when you are talking about the military mind, that mind is always preparing for war. It's all about building up forces, stockpiling some strategic raw materials, and even capturing the industrial production to feed the wartime machinery. Now, what does this really mean? If we are saying that the Africans have been into war for quite some time, and we are now talking about even the countries allocating more of their budgetary monies to the military, preparing for war, that's a military mind. You are not worried about social services. You are not worried about the justice systems. It's merely preparing for war. You are building up some forces all the time. You need a military, which is made up of a lot of men and women, right? You are stockpiling resources. You are diverting some of the resources from what could be produced to benefit people into the production of war materials. That's the military mind, which we say it seems to have gotten hold of the African leadership. They are always into preparing for war. And so we are now supposed to transform that mind from being military to being peaceful. So the need for us to talk about an outright paradigm shift from war to peace. The military mind is very aggressive, because one who has got a gun can victimize anyone. If a person were to come in here with a gun, I'm sure we'd all run under the table. One has got dominion. One has got an imposition of force because one is armed. A military mind is always aggressive. A military mind is selfish. A military mind is selfish. Let all these things belong to me. And I've got enough force, I've got the muscle to take from whoever all these possessions. That's the military mind. The military mind is devoid of vision. And yet we normally say that without a vision, you perish. The military mind does not have a vision. If we are talking about destruction, then let's destroy. Needless to ask a question like, what will become of it if we destroy? I think we have all been seeing what the devastation of structures in Ukraine and so on. The military mind is saying just attack, just destroy. But to benefit whom? If we are destroying the works of our own hands, that's a military mind. That's a military mind. It does not appreciate diversity of opinion. Because the moment you approach someone who has got a military mind and you talk peace, you are labeled a coward. So a military mind actually looks at people who are talking about peace as cowards. Prof, they are a coward. If I had a military mind, then I would say the best way is to fight. Right. So everything is supposed to be gained through force. They are so impatient with dissent. You go against the idea of a person with a military mind. Then you are inviting a fight. The issue of give and take, it seems to be absent when a person is endowed with a military mind. And we are also saying that the issues of bellicosity, that's the desire of just destroying, just dominating. Those are issues which are usually associated with a military mind. So my argument here, which I am making an effort to sustain, is that it is this military mind which seems to have engrossed, which seems to have captured the minds of the leadership in Africa. That's my standpoint. So that now calls for the demilitarization of the mind. If we are to talk peace, we now need to demilitarize the mind. Now, the demilitarization which we are talking about here is not the mechanical demilitarization which we'll be talking about in the military sense. That when you demilitarize, you are talking about the reduction of weapons of war. When you demilitarize, you are now saying no more conscription into the army. When you demilitarize, you are bringing together explosives and you are destroying them. When you no, that's not the demilitarization which you are looking at now. This one is the demilitarization of the mind. That mindset, which has seen the pre-coloniality of violence, that mindset which has gone through the coloniality of violence, the same mind which is reeling under the post-coloniality of violence, is the mind which we now want to demilitarize. Right. Now, what then? UNESCO has got something interesting here, that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. It is us who think about war. So if we are to talk about peace, then we are the same people who are supposed to be looking into it. So we are now talking about reaching into the minds. Unfortunately, it says the minds of men. It should be merely the minds of humans, both men and women. I just had to borrow that men from the UNESCO statement there, but If Redon was here with us, I know she would have boiled over that one to say, now, that's where we are saying, you see, men, patriarchy, and militarism, they are birds of a feather. So in this statement, what I'm merely saying is that we are now supposed to reach people's minds so that we create some new attitudes of mind. Those attitudes of mind which will conform to the basic principles of peace and democracy. There is Mishi, an author who has written quite a lot about the transformation of our spirit, because the inner transformation has to inspire the outer work. Mishi's approach is that of the faith-based transformation of a mind, where the argument is that as we look at each other in the physical sense, our bodies are merely housing a spirit. And it is that inner spirit which has to be convinced and then influence the outer. In other words, if the gospel of peace has been preached unto someone, for conversion, it's not the bodily conversion which starts, but it has to be the inner spirit is supposed to be converted. And that inner spirit, it is going to transform the outer. Because if you now become soft, if the softness emerges from inside, obviously when you are dealing with your associates, we believe you are also now soft. Right. So that's we are still demilitarizing the mind. So it again goes with the realization of intrinsic worthiness and purpose, which does not easily succumb to addictions. You see, there are times when we succumb to certain addictions, and you feel like you are supposed to, if you have been into violence, you feel like you are also supposed to continue fighting. You are involved in street brawls. You are involved in all sorts of things. And whenever you come across people who are already fighting, you feel like you have got to join them. Now, in demilitarizing, we are talking about it as a psychological illness. There are certain forms of inner harmony which we are supposed to be promoting, so that we also discard the outer disharmony. We are talking about a cultivation of mind values and that inner peace, which I don't know if I'm expressing it so well, the inner peace which we are talking about through the psyche, right? How we are thinking. And that psyche is supposed to be strongly rooted in human consciousness. Fanon talks about this issue of human consciousness, and he talks about not really drilling or indoctrinating, but gradually explaining issues, giving some people gradual doses of what you believe is supposed to be learnt until they accept. That's how you would conscientize. That's a word which I think it made from the East, conscientization of the mind. So if there is human consciousness, you respect human life, you respect human dignity, and so that's the demilitarization of the mind which we are expecting. And it also involves a reorientation, which impresses renewal of mind through rethinking. Now, this it means you are now looking back at something which might have happened, and you are now revising it, you are now rewinding it. So there is rethinking, renegotiating, reimagining. Right, you have gotten back into a previous experience. And we are saying that if people started off peaceful, then they unfortunately graduated into violence. We are supposed to revisit their past, which was peaceful. And yes, That's where there is need for some reorientation. That's where there is need for some rethinking. That is where we need to reimagine the past and bring it back if it was peaceful. So that's the demilitarization which we are talking about. So my argument is that in order for us to demilitarize, there is need to introduce peace education. And Montessori said, establishing peace is the work of education. All what politics can do is just to keep us out of war. But if we are to establish peace, then that's the work of education. And so that's the dimension where I'm now coming from. Why we are now supposed to encourage peace education in Africa. UNICEF has it all. Peace education, that's the process of promoting the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values which are needed to bring about behavior change that will enable children, youth, and adults to prevent conflict and violence, both overt and structural, to resolve conflict peacefully and to create the conditions which are conducive to peace, whether at an interpersonal, intergroup, national, or international level. So we are saying that by peace education, we are talking about an education system which we are deliberately designing or intentionally designing to craft a new psyche against militarism. And we are also saying that's a type of education. It might not be appealing to some other people, but it has to be radically different, a radically different education. That is not glorifying war, but it educates for peace and non-violence. That's the education which we are now advocating. The goals, they are so clear, and this run down, providing images of peace building and League of Minds. By League of Minds, we are talking about people who are united. That's a collective experience. There is cooperation. There is togetherness. When we agree that we are going to do something and we go by the letter of what we have actually decided we have to do, we are now talking about a League of Minds. Right. But that League of Minds, it has to be conducive to peaceful cooperation. And the goal is to transform society by nurturing peaceful consciousness and establish widespread support for peaceful policies. That's the goals of peace education. Promote respect for different cultures and people, and even appreciate the diversity of human community. Then also educate for self-understanding as an essential basis for non-violent societies, to empower learners to become agents for social change and a better world. Well, the goals of peace education, I think they are in line with peace and justice. They are in line with, people just living in a peaceful world. Right. Now, in Africa, it's a bit difficult then to talk about peace anyhow. Because of the factors which I'm going to make mention here. That's why I thought there is need for us just to give a SWOT analysis of peace education, that if it were to be made mandatory in Africa, would we achieve our goals? There are certain strengths, there are some weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Right. Under these strengths, recognition that education is important for sustainable development. And that's an important issue. At least the majority of the Africans have now realized that if we are to talk about development, then education is the way. So we can still take advantage because countries are already striving to raise their literacy levels. They are busy working on how the standard of living might change through education as an important veneer here. Then we are also realizing that there are efforts by the African Union. It has got a peace and education cluster, which is making an effort to continentalize peaceful practices through some specialized institutions. The African Union, it plays multiple roles in Africa, but one of its challenges has been the issue of establishing peace and security within the continent. border disputes. Well, that's daily we are talking about one country fighting another. And I know even as of now, Mali, Chad, they are uneasy bedfellows, Kenya, Uganda, they are having problems. You see, those problems, they are still there, but the AU is making some effort. Now, it has come up with a cluster of peace and education, where their intention is to continentalize some peaceful practices. Now, that's a strength because at least we've got some very strong starting point, which is accepted and appreciated at continental level. Then the support from NGOs, yes, there are quite numerous of these interventions which are coming in. We have got some good examples which I have cited here. Kenya and Liberia, these have pioneered how non-governmental organizations can actually be very instrumental when it comes to assisting in setting up some structures which people can utilize in order to bring about peace. The non-governmental organizations, they have been so much into assisting other local community groupings which have been into peace. There are some local peace committees. There are some peace committees which are established at local level, and these have received a lot of assistance from NGOs. Right, it is a strength, but in some cases it also becomes a weakness, and I will explain. Right, then if we are saying that education as our trump card for the realization of peace education, what then are the weaknesses on the ground? One, our education system has largely not been decolonized. Now, what does that mean when you have got an education system which has not been decolonized? Now, we are saying that Africa's problem, in as much as we are talking about literacy rates which are increasing, in terms of skills which are required in order to meet the 21st century's requirements, particularly the technical areas, Africa is still very much behind. Why? Because the education system, it has got some colonial legacy, certain areas which are supposed to be revisited, so that education as it is revamped or it is rebranded. There is too much of theory and little practice. We are talking about more of book knowledge other than practical knowledge, which would mean that even if we were going to teach peace, we would be teaching peace by merely referring to authorities who have said something about peace, but not have an opportunity to apply what we are reading. That's a problem. So it is pervading the entire education systems. And it is only now that some countries are coming up with some new curricular development units where they are saying, we are now supposed to make our education system relevant. We have to make it relevant. So that might be a weakness, where even if those who have got a buy-in into the introduction of peace education might feel that, well, we can allow people to read about it, but not to practice it. That's because of a flawed education system, which I believe it needs some revisiting. Then we still have a lot of some sponsored social collapse, political instability, and endemic poverty, where I'm talking about the paradox of a continent which is poor because she is rich. Now, the issues which I'm making an effort to bring out here is that when we are saying a continent which is poor because she is rich, Africa is endowed with a lot of resources. a lot of resources. We can talk about mineral resources, and I don't think there is any mineral which we may fail to get in Africa. And even the precious oil and gas, they are there. The lithium, they are there. But when you look at the poverty datum lines, the standard of living, Africa is at the very bottom. Why? The reason is that some of the wars which we are talking about, some of the violence, it's sponsored violence. The warlords who are wreaking havoc in Africa are sponsored people. I can give you a good example of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where some mercenaries were actually apprehended by the United Nations. See, in the DRC, there is a certain author, Bade Onimode, who said that in a single shovel, you are bound to get more than 5 minerals. And that is the country which is seriously ravaged with civil war. The sponsors are not from within Africa. They are from Europe. They are from America. And so they are sponsoring some bandits to take control of areas which are rich in minerals. They extract minerals while there is a lot of confusion which is going on. That's the sponsored social collapse which I'm talking about. You see, people are so much into what is it which I benefit out of the violence, and if I'm getting something out of it, then let violence prevail. I mean, that sort of thinking. So that remains a weakness. For as long as the resources are a point of attraction to outsiders, and there is no political will to rid the countries of corruption and make sure that the resources are interlocked and key and they are benefiting the indigenous people, then even our clamor for peace, it will still remain a clarion call, but otherwise very difficult to realize. But at the same time, there are some opportunities. There is a growing recognition of the transformational power of education. That remains a fact. And I don't think that there are any countries in Africa where we may say that education is not a priority. I think it has now become a priority, and we also would give thanks to UNESCO. Yeah, it has been doing quite a sterling job in a number of African countries, some of which had some very remote areas which might have not been touched at all by the education systems. Then there are some success stories also where peace education is being introduced in schools. Kenya and Liberia, they stick out as the two African countries which are now in the forefront, to the extent of mooting the idea of establishing some ministry of peace, where there is a minister who looks at issues of peace. Now, these are just embryonic stages. We still have to find out whether we are going to take root and whether the same ideas are going to be disseminated, whether they are going to percolate into other African countries and be received. Then, so I'm taking that as an opportunity. If there are some countries which have started on something else, then that's an opportunity for other countries to also emulate. If you see that it's something good which is happening, well, you can also learn quite a number of stories from or lessons from what has been done by other countries. And I think that can as well be done if these countries are given opportunity by the AU to also preach their gospel of how they are going about with peace education. Then there are also some safe schools where there has been a declaration of protection of education against military attack. That's a West African practice. That declaration, it's actually operating in West Africa, because it is in West Africa that we have experienced a lot of kidnappings, where school children have been taken by bandits into some forests and held to ransom and so on and so forth. But this piece of education against military attack, it's making some headway. At least it has been there to negotiate for the release of those who might have been captured, and making sure that they monitor school environments to make sure that there are no deliberate attacks from the militia. Right, then there are threats as well. The vindictive political environments and possibly lack of political will from the leadership. This is the issue of peace. I don't know why it is really considered as a very, very sensitive area by the African leadership. Possibly, it ruffles their feathers in that if people discuss peace, then possibly it compromises their positions. And particularly where we have got leaders who are highly militarized because of these military coups, for them to talk about peace, I mean, you are already hitting them below the belt, because that is where their survival is. They thrive in violence. They thrive when they are talking about gun justice. So that's our major threat here. That's our major threat. We would not talk about the survival even of opposition politics, more so to talk about peace education, which might talk about even shifting from manufacturing of weapons of war or buying of weapons of war in order to address social institutions. The leadership tends to be somehow hesitant or reluctant to move away from the war paradigm in order to take on board the peace paradigm. Now, having said that, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by saying that investing in peace through education is so strategic. Strategic in that it promotes resilience, the mitigation of violent conflicts, and it also fosters socio-economic development. Because as I have already indicated, in most African countries, whenever they draw their budgets, the greater chunk of the budget goes along defense, whether it's peacetime or whether it's wartime, which means it's an ingrained practice which has to be undone through demilitarization. And if all ministries of education were to adopt some conflict-sensitive approaches in their policies, then we are saying peace would be guaranteed. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert. Why don't we can take some questions?
Yes.
Yeah. Stay.
Yeah.
You can. I'm just gonna stop sharing this, and you can stay there. Let me. Okay. So if we have questions from the online audience, you can begin. Any questions for Gilbert? Any questions from those present here? Anyone?
Hello, this is Rhea Settles. Thank you so much, Dr. Gilbert. This was a wonderful presentation, totally in alignment with every concept you presented. I am interested in How do you approach? I didn't hear it, maybe I stepped out, but how do we approach? What's some of the approaches for the folks that are in power and they have this militarized mind? They really enjoy it, and it's just really difficult to even get an audience for them to even consider peace.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. What a difficult question. Yeah.
Look, I apologize. I've been doing this work for so long, and it's just really a challenge to get those people to be willful.
Thank you very much. In fact, to realize a breakthrough, as you are saying, that's a bit difficult because as of now, we are really talking about leaders who believe in gun justice. But I would say that every song has a beginning, and even a long journey, it starts with a single step. The fact that we have got some civic organizations which have been operating, no, for your information, you would find that even civic organizations which were into giving people some political education in terms of how one is supposed to exercise a vote, those
Yes.
had to be closed down and people deported and so on. But still, we are having more and more of our own locals now, mooting the
Yes.
idea of having some local committees. Their LPCs, the local peace committees, which are working on within the grassroots level. They are doing so, but again, I would say, at their own risk. That's the problem which we are having. So in terms of
Yes.
approaches, yes, the approaches are, well, they are dicey. They are quite dicey, actually.
We're seeing it here in the United States now with, as students begin to use their voice, and it's not just on the issue, the current issues happening in Palestine, but it's also just other issues where the people at the college level, the officials, really do use their power to silence them.
Mhm. Yes, quite rightly. But one other issue which I thought it would be good for us is that we are just banking on a generational issue which we are starting. See, the people who are so violent as of now, these are the nationalists who were involved in coming up with those liberation movements, and they actually conducted the liberation struggles. And so their thinking is too militaristic, but the failure of their governments is bringing about some dissenting voices. And those dissenting voices are from the young, who are now talking about bringing about change. So my approach then is that if we are talking about generational connections, we are supposed to start with a given generation, which is committed to bring about change. And it is now that we are supposed to start working on it, taking advantage of the schools system where we have to convince the ministry or the ministries of education, rather, to bring into some of their topics. There are some topics which you can actually tell that if we had to add an element of peace education, then it could be understood.
Yes.
Yes, where we are not reinventing the wheel. But the problem is that when you bring peace education and it would appear as if you are talking politics, that becomes a problem now. But if it is just a peaceful coexistence, religious and moral education in Zimbabwe, yes, there have been some efforts to make sure that people live together. But you cannot go further and even talk about how you are supposed to nip a civil war in the bud. You are already sounding political. So I think we can still take advantage of our school's curricula to make sure that slowly but surely we are injecting some elements of peace education until, because of change in leadership, until we get to a point where there are some leaders who might be acceptable to some of these ideas. Because where there is a military regime, civilians would have little to say in terms of the formulation of policy. So I take it that because of any changes which might also be happening in the political front, that might also provide a leeway for peace education activists, I should say. That's how they can come in and possibly bring about some change.
Another question? Please.
Thank you so much for the talk. What an honor to be here and learn from you. I've been doing a lot of thinking about Christy Dodson talks about testimonial injustice in her work on systemic oppression. And I'm thinking of the role of like the militarization, the military mindset. That is very much in place here in the United States. And I see testimonial injustice as a form of structural violence that is kind of a part of policing, historically, structurally. So it's a structural injustice. And so most police are not trained to even like really give a serious consideration of someone's testimony. And I feel like that in and of itself is an act of structural violence. And I was interested in like maybe getting a little bit of your take on the military mindset and sort of systemic testimonial injustice, the connection that might be. Because you really touched on something that made me think a little bit more about the military mindset.
Okay. Oh, yes, there is a nexus between the structural violence and the military mindset. Because most of our policies or even certain acts of parliament, when they are amended with or without consultation, well, in the majority of cases in Africa, without consultation, they have to be observed and imposed making use of state security agents. So if the army is brought in order to make sure that people adhere to a given law, that's structural violence already. If the police, I have got a lot of interest. Possibly, let me give a Zimbabwean example. A new currency was introduced some weeks ago, and a new currency.
Currency?
Yes. It was introduced some weeks ago. We used to have what was called the RTGS. Then this time around, we have got what we call Zimbabwe gold. It's ZIG. Where you are saying $1 here, we are saying ZIG. Right. Now, people came up against the introduction of that currency. And people would now favor not making use of the financial institutions, the banks, but they are getting into the street in order to exchange monies. You need foreign currency, you get into the street. You need foreign currency, you get into the street. So what the government has done, it has now deployed the army. It has deployed the police force. It has deployed its militia to monitor the situation and make sure that no one is trading outside the banking halls, so that they can now make sure their currency is accepted. But then the acceptance is forceful. And the moment you are making use of securocrats, it becomes structural violence because these are arms of law. And the moment you are now making use of them to apply or to implement your laws, that's structural violence. So there is a very, very close link between structural violence and what our military, our police force are doing as of now. The example, the American example which you have given, I think it equally applies. It equally applies.
But isn't that by design?
Hello?
Saying that is by design. I mean, you mentioned post-colonialism. That's what it was created for. The only difference, I think, is it fills the void of power.
Mm.
It's not so much the queen anymore.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
I think, to your point,
Yeah, it's by design. I agree with you. It's by design.
working as intended. That's how it was created. It's doing exactly what it should do.
Yeah, that's
Other questions? I had a question for you, too. I thought the focus on boundaries
yes.
and the creation of artificial borders as a creation of colonialism was very insightful, and that creates an us-them dynamic and the desire to prevail over the other, etc. And so, what I was thinking about is that dynamic, that boundary and protecting boundaries and then superseding boundaries, domination. Has that somehow been internalized in the mind, the militarized mind? And if so, is demilitarizing the mind, would it involve a dissolving of those us-them boundaries in the mind?
Okay.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah. You see, the creation of boundaries. Let me take you a little bit back and say that even the Africans, they have not liked this issue of boundaries, but it's just a way of finding it very difficult to get rid of them. An idea was mooted by Kwame Nkrumah that we need a United States of Africa. And that's the same issue which Muammar Gaddafi of Libya was talking about. And they were actually getting to some conferences where they would say, let's talk about a United States of Africa. If it were to be established, let's suppose it's a success, then that would mean that we no longer have any border disputes. Because we would allow our people to traverse from one country to another without any restrictions. As it is of now, we have had some people who have been divided. The same ethnic group, it has been divided by a boundary. You find some, I don't know if these would be illustrative. Let me just make use of that as a working example, but it's a reality. The boundary which separates Zambia and Zimbabwe. You would have people in Zimbabwe whose relatives are in Zambia, but you can't visit your relative unless you've got a passport. You see? That applies, I think it applies in almost the entire continent. Because these boundaries which were drawn, they were really artificial. They did not consider which type of ethnic group. That's why there are ethnic clashes in the majority of cases. Now, a military mind comes in when you become a jealous guardian of an artificial boundary which was created to divide you. When people are now fighting and say, this is Chad and Mali, you are there. This is Ghana and Nigeria, you are there. I mean, they become highly militarized, and yet what takes them that far is a mere boundary which was created, which people could actually forget about. I don't know why, as of now, we are failing to even get rid of the need for passports in order to get to the next African country. It's an issue which the AU was discussing, that let's get rid of passports and so on and so forth. But it would appear as if that's hitting against a brick wall. Yeah, because there are certain territories where the leadership, it hangs on to its boundaries and sovereignty. Yeah, because the moment you talk about Francophone Africa, Lusophone Africa, I mean, we are already creating problems. So, yeah, a demilitarized mind can think in terms of getting rid of artificial boundaries, which unnecessarily divide people who have got a common history.
Yeah, I think education, a lot of education is designed to sustain those boundaries, those artificial boundaries.
Oh, yes.
And separation, division between people.
Thank you very much. I think it is to...
And that has to, we have to find a way to educate that and implement that kind of education that would transcend those boundaries.
Yeah.
That would seem to be a key to demilitarizing the mind and thereby having a more just, peaceful world.
One last comment because I have to run. Thank you for the presentation. Sorry I was late. I was trapped in online meetings at home. You haven't really addressed the role of educating women. And I saw in your slides you said the man and so on. And I took that literally because I think, and because maybe I'm biased, I think there's a difference in how men and women navigate the world and how they solve problems. For example, women are typically seen as being more collaborative, more engaging, more soft skill-like. And so what do you think about that? What's the role of educating the female population?
Yeah, we would normally say that if you educate a man, you have educated an individual. But if you educate a woman, you have educated a nation. And that's what we actually believe in our school setup. That's exactly what we are believing in as of now. Why it is like that? It's only that the issue of patriarchy is so rooted, particularly in African traditions. It's so rooted. But surprisingly, if I had given some details of some local peace committees which have made it, the Kenya and Liberia I was talking about, these were formed by voluntary women who came together. Why? Because they are the victims of these wars. They are the part of the vulnerable people. And so they understand the situation better than anyone else. Yeah. So I really take that one. And in my broader study, I even bring it out that there is need for the engagement of women if we have to succeed on this aspect of peace education. The women, you see, in an African setup, most of the men have gone into the urban areas, and the women are there with the children in the rural areas. And those are the best teachers, the barefoot teachers, with a lot of even the so-called informal education, which emphasizes on issues like peace. And I believe, yeah, there is no way women can be left out. In fact, in the Zimbabwean experience, where we have had some local peace committees which have made it, even though they were later on suppressed and so on, these are headed by women, initiated by women outrightly.
Well, maybe we should
Yeah.
end at this point.
No, let me
Thank
thank
you
you
very
very
much
much for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciate you being here.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank
for
you,
coming.
Glibert, for your
Thank you. Thank you.
wonderful presentation.
At least, even though it's work in progress, you can find confidence in what you are doing. Yes. Thank you very much.
You're onto something very important.
Mm.
You have to be an optimist.
Very optimistic I am.
Cheers.
Thank you. Well, I think we are done there.
We can end.